afternoon, everyone. My name is Lisa Romero, and I'm on the business development side of CyberSecOp. And I want to thank you all for joining us today for our New York DFS webinar session. Let's give a couple of minutes for everyone to join, and then we can get started. Once again, good afternoon. My name is Lisa Romero, and I work on the business development side of CyberSecOp. And again, thank you for joining us today for our New York DFS webinar. We will be answering questions via chat during the presentation, and we will save Q&A for the end of the presentation. Our presenters today will be Vinny LaRocca, which is CyberSecOp CEO, with support from Jeffrey Walker, our CISO, and our risk manager, Carlos Neto. And we will inform you and answer your questions on New York DFS. And I will now hand this over to Vinny. Vinny, please proceed.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for attending. I see a lot of names out there that I'm familiar with, so we hopefully will do a very good job and answer all your questions. So I know you guys are busy, so I'm going to jump right into it. So this webinar was created in the intent to proactively answer the questions our clients have been asking us in regards to the DFS. So these are, they're common questions. Hopefully we're going to answer everything before we get to the end. And there won't be a lot of questions, but you will have the opportunity to ask some. So the goal of this presentation is to help you understand and identify how the DFS 500 affects your organization, if you need to be compliant with the DFS, and if you are compliant with the DFS. We're also going to touch on the exemptions that are available to some of the organizations, and we'll go through what those exemptions are. So, looking at this slide, this is, what is New York DFS compliance? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. If you're on this presentation, you probably already know what DFS 500 is about. But with that said, in short, it's a data security protection law. And you're seeing more and more of those outside of the New York. This is New York's version of the data protection law. The focus of the DFS is to ensure that your organization is consistently paying attention to the risk framework and putting the controls in place it needs to remediate those vulnerabilities that are identified. So the DFS is pretty clear, right? What the DFS is about is making sure that you've got a program in place that is not a one-time occurrence. So this is a recurring, repeatable, evolving program. And that's important, right? Because if you read through the 500, it's telling you that there are things that are periodic. Now, periodic to most of these requirements is annual. It doesn't stipulate annual, it stipulates periodic. So it's leaving it up to the organization to identify how often it needs to assess itself. And we'll touch on that a little bit more going forward, but really what I wanted to point out here is the DFS is not a program you put in place and then forget about it. This is something that's evolving and needs to be looked at on a regular basis. So the number one question that we're always getting is my firm required to be compliant? So for the most part, if you're required to be compliant with the DFS, you've probably been notified at one time or another by the DFS. But we have come across a number of organizations where that was not the case. So in short, if your organization is registered, licensed, or certified to provide financial services in New York State, you are required to be compliant. Now, the law doesn't actually stipulate it, but that compliance is growing and extending to the supply chain. So what's happening because of all these growing number of data protection and privacy laws that are being pushed out, organizations that are required to be compliant are pushing that out to their vendors and partners in supply chain. So to give you an example of that, we recently had a credit union that operates out of New York State, and they do business through a money transmitter, which is outside of New York State. The credit union was required to be DFS compliant, and because they made that investment in their program to be compliant with the DFS, they mandated that their supply chain, that money transmitter, be compliant. Otherwise, they would have to take their business elsewhere. So this regulation is extending outside of those core financial institutions in New York that are required to be compliant. And really why that's happening is 34% of breaches that occur these days are happening through third parties. So most organizations are becoming more and more aware of that. So even though the regulation may not adhere to those third parties, the driving force is the regulating business. All right, and we just listed some of those businesses there that apply to. But once again, if you're registered or licensed, it applies to you. So we mentioned earlier that we were going to talk a little bit about those exemptions. And here are some of them. If you have less than 10 employees, and this is not you have to meet all three. As long as you meet one or the other, you do meet the requirements for exemption. So if you have less than 10 employees, less than $5 million in gross revenue, and less than $10 million in total assets, then you're exempt. Now, what's very important here is when you're exempt from the full range of the DFS. That doesn't mean you're exempt from everything. So there are such items as the annual risk assessment, the security program, the security policy, for example. Even those organizations that are exempt still are required to meet those components of the program. So it's almost 50% of the requirements. Even if you're exempt, you would still need to meet. So it's very important that you make note of that. I've talked to a number of organizations that have told me they're exempt so they don't have to do anything, even though that they're registered to do financial services in New York State. So that's not the case. Very important that we're aware of that. And a matter of fact, one of the areas that some of the exempt organizations can get in trouble is by the exemption, you're not required to do, as I mentioned, some of these things as a penetration test or a vulnerability scan. Yet you're still required to do an annual risk assessment. By best practices, all risk assessments we do for our customers, our client base, would include a penetration test and a vulnerability scan. So there are some areas in here that leave it open to interpretation. I'd be a little concerned if I was one of these organizations that was exempt and I was really not doing some of those other components. Something for you to think about. It's not required, but it does look like an area that can lead to some trouble down the road. Go to the next one. What's required to be compliant? So this is some of the stuff that I just touched on, right? These are the things that are required for those organizations that don't meet the exemptions. An established security program. And, those components of an established security program as we talked about, would include those things that the exemptions don't have to do. So penetration test, vulnerability testing, those are all part of an established program. The program outlines the ability for you to identify your risk, to remediate your risk, to respond to your risk. And those things are, once again, also very important. To have a program in place that you're not able to act upon is one of the biggest issues that we're seeing out there in the mid-market space. Organizations will have that program in place. They're able to identify an issue in some instances, and then they don't know how to react to it. So putting a established program in place where you've got all those components is very important. Periodic risk assessment, we just touched on that. And as I said before, the DFS uses the word periodic. They don't say annual. They don't give you a fixed time frame. They leave that open to interpretation a little bit. One of the things I would suggest to my client base is that there's a change in your environment. Something changes, new applications, new components of the infrastructure. That's probably the time to do a risk assessment, to know what the impact to that change was in your environment. Periodic penetration and vulnerability assessments, the same thing. They use that word periodic. I would recommend in the financial space to be doing it biannually. That's just a recommendation. Most other mandates required at least on an annual basis, but there is no fixed time frame for that. There is no fixed cadence for it. All right. Documented incident response plan. I can't emphasize enough the importance of this. Just about every data security and data privacy mandate out there mandates an incident response plan. Not only is having one critical to being compliant, it's also critical to keeping your business up and running. Seeing so many organizations these days that when they have to deal with a breach or an incident, don't know who to call, don't know how to respond, don't know what they're required to respond to. In this case with the DFS, if there was a breach, you've got 72 hours to call the Attorney General. So those type of things are very important that we get those outlined and they're documented and your people know how to use those. I'll go back. Multi-factor authentication. I've used this analogy probably 1,000 times. Multi-factor authentication these days is like having airbags in a car. It's almost a must-have. You know, an institution not having multi-factor at this point, above and beyond the DFS, it's just critical to the prevention of a potential breach. Audit trail, this is another one that if you're exempt, you don't have to worry about. I would tell you an audit trail is very important. We've seen a number of organizations that have had to deal with breaches. In the event that you have to respond to potential clients that were involved in that breach, if you can't verify through an audit trail what data was actually compromised, you're responsible for the communication to every potential client within your data set. So for example, if you've got 1,100 users and you can verify that the data for only 12 of them was compromised, you'd only be responsible for communicating and possibly providing LifeLock to those 12 users. But if you couldn't do that because you don't have an audit trail, you'd be held responsible for all of them. Encryption of non-public information, that's pretty self-explanatory. And a Chief Information Security Officer. Once again, if you're exempt, you don't have to worry about that. If you're not exempt, you're supposed to have a Chief Information Security Officer. This is somebody who's going to be doing the regular filing and has the knowledge base to be able to deal with all these other things that we just outlined. So I've seen a number of organizations who have put a name in place as their Chief Information Security Officer who really don't have the knowledge to do the job, and that can get you into additional trouble, right, by filing false information or just inaccurate information. These days, you don't want to have policies and procedures that you cannot govern or enforce. That's probably worse than not having it in the first place. So what happens if my business is not compliant by June 1? Well, it's already past June 1, right? So luckily for a lot of us, there hasn't been an impact. but their potential for impact is great, right? So organizations can be subject to fines, and we've already seen a number of the larger organizations get hit with fines. They haven't really hit that mid-market space yet, but as these issues and breaches continue to grow, I'm sure we're going to see more and more of that. You may lose business and customers to organizations that are compliant. And what we mean by that is, if I've got the ability to deal with a registered investment advisor, and I'm going to put my money somewhere, am I going to put my money with somebody who's compliant or somebody that isn't? You know, most consumers out there have a lot of choices these days. So being compliant is becoming more and more of a factor in those decisions. If you're part of a supply chain, once again, as the example I used earlier, if the lead organization is compliant and their supply chain isn't, they may go in a different direction and start dealing with vendors and partners that are compliant. They're not going to spend the money to put themselves in a secure position and then put themselves at risk by utilizing a third party that is not compliant. And if you were breached and you lose client data, you potentially open yourself up to litigation, right? So if you're out there and you're supposed to be compliant and you're not, and you lose an end user's information, their financial information, on top of being fined, you could open yourself up to litigation because you're not compliant. So penalties for noncompliance. Once again, the DFS is not very specific as to the fines that they could lay out. Going by some of the other mandates and organizations out there, what we have seen in the past is, on average, you're looking at $2,500 a day through a time frame when the violation continues. So when it's identified that you're not compliant to when you become compliant. And the one thing I will tell you, we've had this conversation a number of times, is you're not compliant overnight. That's something that's going to take time to put controls in place, to create policies, create plans. So, organizations that are fully non-compliant, if they needed to get compliant, it's something that can take time. So they really need to think about it well in advance. $15,000 per day in the event of any reckless or unsound practice. Have not seen that yet, but once again, worst case scenario. And $75,000 per day in the event of a knowing and willful violation. So if, for example, you were audited and you were told you're not compliant, a lot of times they'll give you a time frame to become compliant. In the event that you were to get re-audited in that time frame or have a breach, that's when you can get hit with fines of those size. And just over to the right, we outline some of the organizations that have already got fined, and you can see the size of these fines. Jumping over to the next slide, we'll just do a quick little case study about how fast those fines can grow. So as we talked about, the fines of $2,500 a day. If you're looking at 31 days in fines, you're right there. You're at $77,000 in potential fines. So one of the things to think about is, and as we look below, the ROI, return on investment. We have the conversation with a lot of organizations almost on a daily basis. What is the cost for me to become compliant? What is the cost of me to put this security program in place? Well, just using the average for us in that mid-market space, a customer will be looking at potentially $38,000, right? In the scheme of things, just looking at that compared to the potential in fines alone, that's really a no-brainer. So it really shouldn't be, the question shouldn't be what is the cost to become compliant? It's really what is the cost of not being compliant? And as we mentioned, you look back on all the slides we put out there for non-compliance, potential for fines, potential for losing customers, potential for losing vendors, potential for litigation. And these mandates, these data privacy and data protection mandates are not going away. So for organizations that are not investing in becoming compliant, it really doesn't make financial sense. It makes more financial sense to become compliant. I would actually tell you we're having more and more conversations these days with marketing managers. Marketing managers are using compliance as a differentiator. They're out there advertising to the world that, hey, against my competitors, here's why you should deal with me. I'm compliant, I'm protecting your data, I'm protecting your privacy. So something for the organization to think about, another reason to make that investment. So some important deadlines. So as we know, the registration date is already passed, June 1st. I would recommend, if you haven't already registered, now's the time to do it, better sooner than later. As we said, if you haven't gotten audited, then that's fine. There's no one's gonna come and slap you for registering late, but it needs to be done ASAP. And once again, we mentioned this earlier. If you don't make the deadline, you are required to notify the DFS within 72 hours of a cybersecurity event. And now, if you don't have an incident response plan in place, do your people know how to identify a cybersecurity event? All these things are tied together. So it's important that we're training our staff and our employees on user awareness, how to identify these type of events. And just quickly, I'll put that up, keep that up there for a couple of minutes. The portal to go for the DFS and to register. If you haven't done so already, you should get that out there. Once again, part of the DFS is going to be on a regular basis submitting the updates to your security program. Right? There's one more, right? So how do I get started? Once again, the website that we just mentioned, it's important that you go out there and register. Identify if you're exempt. If we didn't give you enough information for that, by all means contact us and we can help you with that. But as I said earlier, it's important to reiterate, even if you're exempt, there are components of the DFS that you need to comply with. It's not an all or nothing. And you can still get audited. Some of the things that are driving these audits, most of them are being targeted towards the larger organizations. But in the event you had to deal with a breach, there are other laws out there, such as the state's breach communication laws. If you were to get breached, you're required to call the Attorney General. The Attorney General could very well reach out and notify the DFS if you're a financial institution. So there's a number of ways where you can get audited. All right, so one of the things we're here to is help guide you through the process, help you with anything that you need help with. As I said earlier, the cost of non-compliance is way more expensive than the cost of compliance. How long does it take to be compliant? Another great question. We get this all the time. And the answer is, it depends, right? And I know nobody wanted to hear that answer, but it really does depend on how many locations you have, how many users you have, how many endpoints, that's laptops, desktops. Those types of things are very important. The more controls that need to be put in place, that's also going to change the length of the engagement to get you compliant. If an organization has half the controls in place today, obviously it's going to be a lot quicker than an organization that has nothing in place. Most of the time where we need to start, because the organizations we're dealing with don't really know where they fall as far as compliance, is to do some sort of assessment. We are able to help some organizations by providing them with a self-assessment. If you really know what's going on in your own organization, you can do a self-assessment, which will help you with the filing for the DFS. But worst case scenario, you're looking at 8 months to become compliant. Best case, I know it says 1 up there. From what I've seen, it's usually at least 2 months to get an organization compliant with the DFS. And it's important that you understand that, because as we talked about with those penalties earlier, if you were put in a position where you needed to become compliant, it can take you a while. We also had an organization not too long ago that lost an opportunity to do business with a much larger organization because they weren't compliant. They reached out to us and said they needed to be compliant within a week, and there was no way we can make that happen, so they lost that opportunity. So on top of just trying to make the DFS happy, there's a lot of cases where you're trying to make your potential client base happy. But one of the things I want to touch on here is third-party management. We touched on that a little bit before. This is a large variable, right? So depending on how many third-party vendors you utilize that potentially have access to your data, your systems, your network, that can have a big impact on how long it would take to put a program in place to get you compliant. But this is also, in addition to being compliant, it's a critical component of your program. As I said before, third parties are now in a position where they're going to be reaching out to their vendors, their partners, their customers, and mandating that they be compliant. So understanding who your third-party base is, and if they are compliant, doing an assessment of them is a critical component of the program. So quickly, how can CyberSec help? As we mentioned, we're putting programs in place to get customers compliant with DFS. One of the things that I wanted to point out that I didn't touch on, and I want to bring it up now. If your organization is compliant with the GLBI, the NIST, or PCI, you probably already are DFS compliant, something to be aware of. Because what we really push for a lot of our organizations, especially organizations that are doing business throughout the United States, is to try to focus on a larger framework, such as a NIST or an ISO or a SOC 2. If your organization is compliant with those frameworks, you're going to meet the requirements of 90% of those data privacy and data protection laws that are out there. And instead of trying to be compliant with each individual law, setting yourself for that higher standard will help you meet the requirements of all. So, CyberSecOp, we can help organizations assess where they are, what's their DFS posture. We can advise them on what it takes to get compliant. We can also help implement those gaps, the remediation to those gaps, and then more importantly, govern. So as I talked about on the first slide, putting a program in place and then walking away is not how this works. This is something that's living and evolving. So governing those policies and procedures that you put in place, making sure that your employees are aware of how it affects them, letting your user base, your client base understand how you're enforcing these laws is critical. Putting a policy in place that's not being enforced can get you in more trouble than not having the policy in the first place. Yep. Do I do business in New York State? Do I have clients in New York State, branches in New York State, headquartered? Am I registered in New York State? Goes back to what we talked about in one of the earlier slides. It really comes down to if you're registered, certified, licensed in New York State. If you're meeting one of those requirements, you really need to be DFS compliant. So what we're going to do now is, that's really the meat of the presentation. I'm going to open this up for Q&A. Anybody, and I know we had some Q&A going through the chat, but we'll open this up now for anybody who's got questions. Just make sure everybody's unmuted first. Okay, so I don't know if anybody was trying to ask a question. I think we had some mute issues, so any questions, by all means. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Vinny, this is Jeff. A few people are still muted.
Yeah, I think now everybody's unmuted.
We've asked everybody.
So, yeah. So once again, anybody has any questions, and now everybody's unmuted, I apologize for that. Feel free to chime in. All right, so one of the things we're going to put up then, we're going to put up a quick poll. If anybody who's on wouldn't mind participating, greatly appreciated. While we're putting the poll up, if there's any questions, by all means. If there's no questions, we'll give everybody some time back in the day.
Somebody logged in. One of our guys logged in.
what would you charge a small financial services company, say 2 or 3 employees? They don't want and they don't have a need for full managed service provided. They just need help in getting a program together so that if an auditor came in, there's paperwork in the file. Or do you not even go that low in your service offerings?
No, we would certainly help out a customer in that position. It's kind of a hard question to ask without knowing more about what the scope is.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're kind of really looking, it sounds to me like you're looking to do some sort of a gap assessment, identify what the gaps are in your DFS plan, and then put a program in place just to remediate them. Once again, it's really hard to, without knowing what it is we're doing. But so just so you know, your high end, as we talked about, a full program would be $38,000. So for something what you're talking about, you're probably a third of that. But once again, I don't have a definitive scope there.
Sure, I got it. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yep. Anybody else? Did the poll go out?
Yes, I have a question. What are some of the things that need to be taken into consideration if I am merging with another company?
Good question. Once again, so it's important to identify if that other company falls under the same requirements as your company. So are they required to become DFS compliant? So the regulating body, so whoever's going to be the mothership, I guess, for the best way to put it, when it's all said and done, if they're doing business in New York State, they're registered, licensed, or certified, then they're going to need to be compliant. So that would fall to the entire organization.
Another question. So we have persons who are, so we need to have the role of CISO. What if I have an IT manager who performs to that role? Is it necessary to still have someone with that specific title?
Well, for the purpose of the DFS, he would be your ISO. You could designate him as the ISO. It really comes down to his knowledge required to be the ISO. If he's got the knowledge to deliver the components of the DFS, then that's fine. They're not. Yeah,
so
Jeffrey.
Vinny, let me help you out with that. So the segregation rule is that there need to be some kind of segregation. So this IT person would have to then move to that role to apply the segregation between IT and security that are required by DFS. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Any additional questions currently?
I do apologize. We're having a little problem with the with our poll. We'll try to get that out to everybody at a later date. We'll send that out. Any other questions? I'm not rushing anybody off. All right, everybody, I appreciate the time. Have any questions, you're free to reach out to us. And thank you for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope this session has been informative, and please let us know if you have any questions. Our contact information is there. We're available via email, phone, website, all those platforms. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.